Welcome to Dear Fans. An ordinary grocery trip turns into an unforgettable showdown when an elderly woman tells basketball star Caitlin Clark to go back to Europe. What she says next isn't just a mic drop, it's a cultural earthquake. The grocery store buzzed with the hum of daily errand shoppers push their carts through the aisles, some lost in thought, others chatting quietly. It was a sunny afternoon in Des Moines, Iowa, where Caitlin Clark had grown up, but today the usual flow of routine was about to break in the most unexpected way. Near the produce section, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, probably in her late 70s, stood adjusting her glasses. She had an air of impatience, muttering under her breath as she reached for a bag of apples. Her faded cardigan and carefully pinned silver hair gave her an unassuming look, but what followed was anything but Caitlin Clark, dressed in her signature laid-back style with an Iowa hockey hoodie and athletic leggings, approached the same stand, reaching for a bag of oranges nearby. Calm and polite, she blended effortlessly into the flow of the store, texting on her phone while balancing a basket of groceries. When it happened, Mrs. Thompson turned sharply, noticing Caitlin's presence, and her expression shifted. It wasn't subtle. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips pursed tightly. "You people don't belong here," she said loudly enough for others nearby to hear. Caitlin froze, her fingers hovering over her phone. When she looked up, Mrs. Thompson continued, her tone sharp and cutting. "Why don't you go back to Europe, where you came from?" The air seemed to thicken. A couple of shoppers nearby stopped in their tracks. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others pretended not to hear. The rhythm of the store halted, replaced by an awkward silence that stretched far too long. Caitlin's initial reaction was shock. Her brow furrowed, and for a moment it looked like she might say something immediately, but she didn't. Instead, she took a slow breath, her face unreadable, as though she was weighing every possible response. Mrs. Thompson, still clutching her apples, stood her ground, unapologetic and firm. The tension was palpable, and everyone within earshot could feel it. A young mother named Elena quickly steered her child away, while an older man near the potatoes, Mr. Ramirez, glanced nervously at Caitlin, waiting to see what she would do. The silence that followed was heavier than any words, setting the stage for what would come next. For a moment, Caitlin stood completely still, her hand gripping the handle of her grocery basket. The world around her seemed to shrink. Every sound in the store was muffled, and every face turned in her direction. The weight of Mrs. Thompson's words hung in the air like a bad smell no one could escape. Mrs. Thompson didn't back down. Her stance was defiant, as though she expected no argument. She adjusted her cardigan with a huff, her chin lifting in a way that dared Caitlin to respond. A young employee stacking bananas a few feet away, Marcus, froze mid-motion, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. A cashier named Lisa craned her neck to get a better view. The growing crowd didn't move closer, but they didn't leave either. They were witnesses now, whether they liked it or not. Caitlin glanced at Mrs. Thompson, her face calm but her eyes full of thought. 1,000 responses raced through her mind. She could lash out, yell, or storm off, but none of those options felt right. The tension pressed on her like a weight, but instead of breaking, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. She shifted her basket to her other hand and straightened her posture, her presence growing larger in the silence. Her voice, when it came, was calm but deliberate, cutting through the awkward atmosphere. "Man," she began, her tone measured, "do you even realize what you just said?" Her question wasn't accusatory, it was reflective, almost as if she was giving Mrs. Thompson a chance to think about her words. But Mrs. Thompson didn't seem interested in reflection. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." That was it. A young woman near the bread aisle, Jessica, gasped audibly, and the quiet murmur of the crowd grew louder, yet Caitlin remained steady. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she take a step closer. Instead, she let the pause stretch, giving Mrs. Thompson's words a chance to settle into the ears of everyone around them. "All right," Caitlin said, finally, nodding slowly. Her calmness was disarming, almost unsettling in its strength. "Let's talk about that since you brought it up." The room held its breath, waiting for her response. The storm was coming, but it wasn't the kind anyone expected. Caitlin shifted her weight, setting her basket down on the floor with deliberate care. Her calmness felt like gravity, pulling everyone closer. Even those pretending not to listen. She fixed her gaze on Mrs. Thompson, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet determination that made the older woman shift uncomfortably. "You said I don't belong here," Caitlin began, her voice steady but firm. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." Her words carried weight, each one spoken as if it had been carefully chosen. "My great-great-grandparents were immigrants, just like many Families here, she said, they came to this country with nothing, worked tirelessly, and built a life. My family has been in Iowa for generations. My grandparents farmed the land. My parents raised me to believe in the values of hard work, kindness, and respect. Mrs. Thompson's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The crowd, however, was transfixed. A man near the dairy section, who had been glancing at his phone, Tom, put it down entirely. An older couple, the Wilsons, whispered to each other, but didn't look away. My father, Caitlin, continued, her voice gaining strength, taught me to love this country not because it's perfect, but because it gives us the chance to be better. He worked his entire life to provide for us, and my mother taught in public schools for decades, helping kids from all backgrounds learn and grow. A hush fell over the room. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed quieter now. And me, Caitlin said, her tone softening, without losing its intensity. I've represented this country. I've played basketball on courts around the world with the U.S. flag on my jersey. I've heard our anthem play while standing on a podium. So you're telling me I don't belong here, that I should go back to Europe? Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are, maybe even more, because my family paid the price for it in sweat, tears, and sacrifice. Mrs. Thompson's face flushed. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her apples. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but stopped, her words catching in her throat. Caitlin took a step back, her composure unshaken. I could have walked away, she said, addressing the entire crowd now, but what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this, to be better than words like those. The weight of her words lingered, but the story wasn't over, yet the crowd's reaction would speak louder than anything else. The silence after Caitlin's words was almost deafening. For a moment, no one moved. Mrs. Thompson's face was a work of emotions, anger, embarrassment, and something deeper, something that looked almost like shame. She glanced around the crowd as if searching for an ally, but none came. A middle-aged man with a baseball cap, Derek, stepped forward. She's right, Derek said, his voice breaking the quiet. We've got to be better than this. His words seemed to break a spell. An older woman near the frozen foods, yes. Mrs. Garcia nodded. My dad fought in World War II, she said softly, her voice trembling. He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag. The murmurs began to grow. A young cashier no older than 20 named Ava called out from her station, I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, now visibly flustered, clutched her cart tightly. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. Her voice, when it finally came, was quieter, almost pleading. I didn't mean, but she stopped herself. Caitlin turned back to her expression softer. Now it's not about what you meant, she said gently. It's about how it came across. Words matter, actions matter. Even more. A man from the deli counter, James, clapped slowly, breaking the tension. It was hesitant at first, but then others joined in, the sound swelling into something undeniable. People clapped not just for Caitlin's words, but for the courage it took to confront hate with dignity. Mrs. Thompson looked around one last time, her face pale, before quietly wheeling her cart toward the exit. As she walked away, a few people moved to comfort Caitlin. One woman, Tanya, placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Caitlin smiled faintly, lifting her basket back into her hand. Sometimes, she said almost to herself, it's not about winning or losing, it's about making sure people hear the truth. The crowd slowly dispersed, the tension in the air replaced by a sense of reflection. Some looked inspired, others thoughtful, but everyone seemed changed in some small way. The moment had passed, but the impact of Caitlin's words was far from over. As the crowd returned to their routines, the atmosphere in the grocery store felt different, quieter, more thoughtful. Caitlin finished her shopping, her steps measured, as if she were processing everything that had just happened. The weight of the moment hadn't shaken her, but it had left her reflective. At the checkout line, the young cashier, Ava, who had spoken up earlier, scanned Caitlin's items with a shy smile. What you said back there? Ava hesitated, then continued. It meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with such grace. Caitlin smiled back, her tone warm. Sometimes grace is the only way to break through anger, she responded. Anger just builds walls. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot in Des Moines. As Caitlin walked to her car, she noticed Mrs. Thompson sitting in hers, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, Caitlin thought about walking over to her, but decided against it. Some lessons take time to settle, and she had already said what needed to be said. Later that evening, Caitlin sat with some friends at her home, recounting the day's events. They listened, intently nodding in agreement. You did the right thing, Caitlin, one of her friends, Leroy, said finally, not just for yourself, but for everyone who is watching. People like They might not change overnight, but you planted a seed. That's all you can do. Sometimes plant the seed and let it grow. Caitlin nodded, her friend's words resonating deeply. She realized that while the encounter had been uncomfortable, it was necessary. Ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted, and silence only allows it to fester. Across town, in a quiet home in West Des Moines, Mrs. Thompson sat at her dining table staring at the untouched plate of food in front of her. Caitlin's words replayed in her mind, each one cutting through the armor of her assumptions. She thought of her own grandchildren and the world they were growing up in. For the first time, she felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Doubt in the days that followed, the story of what had happened at the grocery store in Des Moines spread through the community. People talked about Caitlin's response, her courage, and the dignity with which she handled the situation. It became more than just an incident. It became a lesson, a reminder of the power of words and the importance of standing up for what's right. Caitlin didn't seek attention for what she had done, but her actions rippled through the community in ways she hadn't expected. Strangers approached her with gratitude, sharing their own stories of prejudice and resilience. Her quiet stand had sparked conversations that had long been avoided. Mrs. Thompson, too, began to change. It wasn't immediate, but she started to question the beliefs she had held for so long. She didn't know if she'd ever see Caitlin again, but if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to apologize. Moments like these remind us of the power of kindness, strength, and truth in the face of ignorance. They teach us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. It can mean speaking calmly with conviction and letting the truth do the rest. Like this video and subscribe this channel. Thank you.